All right, popular demand, FMC 101. This is going to be focused on the latest version of both Firepower and Firepower Management Center, version 6.2. And, have a look at the YouTube notes. I break down kind of all the things that we're going to cover during this 1 hour session. But before we kick things off, I just want to review this topology that we're going to be using. And you're going to see this reference throughout the video in certain areas. Feel free to pause it, have a look, reference it to what I'm doing on the interface. And it should help give you a deeper understanding of exactly what we're trying to accomplish. So if you have a look at the orange switch, for example, this is where our DMZ is going to hang off of, and we're going to have a web server. We're going to do some static NAT there. The purple switch is actually a layer 2 grouping of devices where we're going to actually put policy in place, and we're going to VLAN stitch. Even though they're all on the same layer 3 network, we're actually going to stitch the two hosts together because they're both on separate VLANs, and that's how we're going to enforce policy. We have a span session, so the blue device there, we're actually going to just tap a port and monitor all the sessions. The green switch is the inside switch with a host on it. We're going to do dynamic NAT there, some Active Directory integration. And then we move over to the management network where we've got a Active Directory in the management side, as well as Cisco's Firepower user agent to give us integration with user to IP mapping so we can do enforcement within Firepower itself. So reference the diagram as needed. Pause the video at any point in time, but let's get this started. So FMC 101, really focused on the network administrator. So again, there's a topology. We ran through it, but the idea is that we'll reference this throughout the video, and if you have any questions, you can always just refer back to it. So the first thing we're going to do, so I've already deployed the OVF. I'm using a virtual infrastructure here to do this scenario, and I already have deployed the OVF for Firepower Threat Defense as well as Firepower Management Center. So once you do that, there's some basic setup, and it's fairly basic, and I have other videos that show each one of those steps, but it's just basically you're going to give it an IP address and bring it up. And at that point, once you do that, then you can connect to the GUI and finalize the configuration for the base setup. So as you can see here, IPs were already there, but we're going to add some a host name, DNS information. We can also go through here and add the updates. I'm not doing that in this session, but you can certainly schedule updates as needed. I'm really focused on getting the core box up and running and passing traffic so we have policy in place and doing a certain level of inspection. So here we're picking a time zone, and we'll hit apply. So throughout the video itself, what you're going to notice is, or you may not notice, but the idea is that I fast forward certain areas that take some time. So when you hit the apply here, that takes some time to crunch. In this case, I'm jumping to the next-gen firewall, or some may call it a sensor, and I'm actually configuring the manager. So the box that we just configured was the manager, and now we're on the next-gen firewall, and configure manager add the IP address, and then a key that we're going to use to establish a secure connection between the devices. And obviously that way we can authorize the device as well. So in our case, we're using Cisco 123. So this is all pre-configured, and I really didn't have to show this part. I could have done this as part of my finalizing the setup, but I wanted to show you that it's a fairly clean installation and how easy it is to add to the manager. So that's it. And at that point, the box comes up. We now have the device, the next-gen firewall or sensor pointing to FMC, but we haven't allowed it on the Firepower Management Center. But first, we're going to enable smart licensing. So, and in our case, we're just going to use the 90-day evaluation, sorry. You can also go in and register your smart licensing, and there's lots of videos on YouTube in regards to the steps that are required for or to enable smart licensing. So we have that next-gen firewall trying to connect to FMC, but we have to add the device itself. So here we go. We're going to add the device. We'll give it a name. We'll put in that key that we mentioned earlier, Cisco 123. We could put it in a group. In our case, we're not going to do that. And we'll apply an access control policy. Now, we don't have one created. So what we're going to do is create a very simple policy. We're just going to enable network discovery at this point in time, and then we'll come back to it. We'll configure it in the manner of which that we want to deploy the policy itself. We're going to enable some licensing, and I'll probably get an error here because the IP address, there it is. The IP address is, I forgot the dot between 1 and 253. And now we'll hit register. Now, again, this will take some time, right? And when I say time, I'm talking minutes, right? So this will establish, it's a one-time setup. Once it's done, it'll come in, and again, the device should show as green. Now, it may look in the video that it went fairly fast, but I just quickly paused and then came back to it. So now we can see it's green, so that's fantastic. Now we've added the device, right? So now we have the ability to start building out policy. So again, here's a reference back to the topology that we're using, and we're going to go back now and add a couple of interfaces, because by default, the Firepower Threat Defense OVF, or virtual instance, only comes with 4 interfaces. And as you can see, we have a couple that are required for the inline set, right? So where we're going to do layer 2 VLAN stitching between devices. Now that could be a series of devices that talk to a router, and we just move the router SVI, for example, into a different VLAN and we stitch it together. Or it could be still a layer 3 network where we break it up, where we have a web tier, an app tier, and a DMZ tier, and we build policy around that. So we're going to add a couple of interfaces. Here I'm adding them to the proper network that I've built already. This one here is going to be a passive interface. And what you're going to see here is I'm just going to grab, I've got a network here that's already capturing all the VLANs in promiscuous mode. So we're good. We've added them. Fantastic, right? Now we've got some additional interfaces. But in order for the virtual machine to leverage these interfaces, we're going to have to reboot the box itself. And then we'll have a refresh. Now, again, if we're going to reboot the next-gen firewall, that does take some time for it to restart. As well as in a minute, you're going to see I'm going to go in and refresh the interfaces. In the meantime, we can still use the platform, right? It's still fully available to us. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a platform policy that's specific to the devices themselves. So what this allows us to do is, again, you're going to see this throughout the video, is Firepower Management Center empowers you to create object-like things throughout the platform. So whether that's an IPS policy, a malware policy, whether that's identity or platform policy, you build out these, you add the elements that you are interested in, and then you apply it to multiple devices, or a single device for that matter. But for most cases, it's about creating once and using many. And here I'm just going through, just showing you a couple of settings, right? Secure shell, SMTP, time synchronization, etc. Now that is applied, we still have to deploy it, and we're going to come back in stages throughout the series, or this video, and we're going to deploy throughout. Now, again, that initial interface, and we're rebooting the next-gen firewall that when we added those interfaces, we're still using the platform, the manager, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a couple of objects. And these objects are going to reference the topology that I showed you earlier, where we're going to grab things like the inside network, the DMZ network, the host within the PCI environment, as well as other objects of interest. Now, in this case, I'm just using single objects, right? But you can also group these objects together. And if you look on the left side, what you're going to see on the left side is, the network, port, interface, tunnel zone, geolocation, variable set, security intelligence, sinkholing, you name it. You have the ability to create objects and then use them throughout the manager itself, whether that's in policy or other. You certainly can leverage them, right? So, for example, you can create objects and leverage them in search, right? So it's quite powerful. It saves the admin some time from having to always go and recreate things, right? So, for example, you could be in policy, and we'll see this later on in the video, and you don't have an object created. You don't have to dump out of here or out of the access policy that you're building, for example, and then jump into objects, create the object, go back to. You can actually create them within the access policy itself. So we should be getting close. This is probably one of the longer tasks of doing, but obviously fairly trivial. It's just a matter of capturing the objects, giving them a name based on whatever naming convention you come up with, and be done with it. So here's that's the VLAN 15 host, right? So these two hosts that we're going to create here are part of that inline set where we're going to stitch VLAN 15 and 16 together, even though those hosts are on the same network. All right, so we've got a bunch of objects created. Fantastic. Okay, so let's go back to that device manager and let's have a look. Our device is up. Let's go into interfaces, and then we're going to refresh this. And what's going to happen again, this takes a little bit because we're actually going to probing the device, and now we're pulling those interfaces that we just added. Now that we have them, we'll save them out. And now we're going to go through and configure the interfaces based on the topology that we created. So we're going to create a outside network and enable, right? Make sure that you enable that interface. And then what we're going to do here is build out the outside zone. So this is an example of where an object isn't available, but we don't have to go to Objects tab to create it. And I'll show you later. We'll go back in and we'll look at those zones that we've created here, right? So give it an IP address. In our case, that's all we got to do here. And I did a typo, /24, right? So you can certainly use, variable length subnet masks here. The day of where you couldn't do that is obviously long gone, but here you can do that like /24 or 32 or whatever bit count from a subnet perspective that you want to leverage. And anytime that you seem to make a mistake, a lot of times the box will turn red. So you'll know exactly where you've made an error. So we've got the inside, outside, now DMZ, right? So these are all layer 3 interfaces, right? We're going to use them, and we're going to route between them. We're going to create NAT policy where appropriate. We're going to have access control policy with maybe some additional advanced threat. Now, in this video, I didn't get into security specific items like configuring IPS. Even though you can create a base template within 2 seconds, I didn't show that, nor did I show things like malware policy. Again, very simple and trivial to create, but I wanted to focus on the network administrator, right? And those elements, if you like, could be contributed to more of a security-centric focus or a security administrator themselves, right? So I kept those 2 pieces out. Again, I've got lots of YouTube videos on how to do each one of those tasks. And again, they're fairly trivial. So here we're going to create the inline set. Now we're going to create the 2 interfaces here, but that's it. So you can see there's IPv4, v6, but we're not touching any of that, right? So all I'm doing right now is just giving it a name so I can reference or know what the object is later on, even though, you know, I can obviously look at the interface. But so I've given it a name. We're not touching any of that stuff. We're not changing the mode, right? So now that we have it, we'll save it and we will jump over to inline sets. So while I was talking to, you may have seen that we already created the passive interface. So that bottom interface, the very last one, we created a passive zone, and we actually selected passive in regards to the mode. So this is where we can put our tap in, and this is up and running at this point, right? This is available. So here we've created the inline set. Just double check here. We'll look at the advanced. You can see there's tap mode, propagate, link state, TCP enforcement, and then there's some snort fail open capabilities there. We wanted to leverage those. We'll go back to that interface, and we can see now when we go into it that it's changed, right? It removed all the IP stuff, right? So let's create a zone just so we can leverage a zone within policy later on. So maybe we'll just simplify this and call it VLAN 15 zone. And then we'll do the same for VLAN 16. Except we'll call it VLAN 16 zone. And like I said, that gig 05, you can see that we created the passive interface. Okay, save this out. Looks good. And let's just jump over here to objects and ensure that you can see the object. So we're going to break down each one of these just so you can see them, but you can see, you know, the device that's tied to that object, in our case zone or security zone, and you could you get to see the interfaces associated to them. All right, so we're going to hit a deploy, and the magical wonders of video is going to make this go obviously a lot faster than typical deployment. Roughly a deployment's about 1 minute and 40 seconds, but it can vary depending on what you're pushing and how much you're pushing. There's obviously a sanity check that happens when it pushes policy. So you know, if you had something configured wrong, we'll give you a message letting you know what that might be. So here we're going to create a NAT policy. And again, we associated the device that we're interested, and we're going to use dynamic NAT here. And what we're going to do basically is go from the inside to the outside. And we're going to translate the inside network to the interface IP address on the outside. And that's it. Now you have NAT up and running. There's a couple other advanced settings that you could leverage, but in this case, that's it. And once we push this, we have NAT capabilities. But, sorry, so what we're going to do first, though, is in order to get outbound, we're going to have to add a route, right? So we can NAT all we like, but once we get into the external network, it's not going to know necessarily how to get to the default gateway, right, to the internet. So, you know, there's OSPF, there's RIP, BGP, multicast. You can have multi-processes with OSPF, like you know, traditional ASA. But in this case, what we're going to do is on the outside interface, we're going to use any network, and the gateway is 2.1.245.1 in my environment. We're not going to do any route tracking, and now we can route to the gateway, and items beyond the external network will know how to get back to us, and we'll know how to get out to them, right? So a quick view of the topology. You can see all the interfaces have turned green. If you missed that, you can certainly pause at any point, go back. So now we'll go and create a couple of quick rules, right? In our case, we're going to create a monitor URL rule You can add rules here. You can add rules up on the right as well, right? So here, or add category, right? Or you can go up and just hit add rule at the top or add category. So, you know, it's fairly convenient, but we're going to create that monitor URL, and that monitor URL is going to allow us to monitor all URLs, but the monitoring action itself is actually going to do exactly that, monitor, but allow us to hit the next policy in line, right? So just because it matches this policy, it doesn't end the access control hierarchy process, right? We're going to start at the top, and if it's monitor, we'll go to the next policy. If it is something like an allow, then once a match is hit, the match is hit. So we'll give it a name. We'll change the action to monitor. We grab the inside network, right? Now we'll go to URLs. And in our case, we're just going to grab a couple of items here. So we're going to say any except uncategorized, all reputations, and then uncategorized as well. But it really doesn't matter. Once we start capturing the URLs, it's going to capture it regardless of the category. Here we're going to do, we're going to create in our case, threat inspection. So we're going to allow the flow from inside to outside. And we're going to add the inside network, for example, and then we're going to create, we're going to add an inspection. So the assumption here is that we're using the default, but the assumption here would be the security administrator may create these policies already for you, right? So the IPS policy they would develop, as well as the malware policy, and then you would just attach it based on the requirements. So what we did from that initial screen, and we'll come back to it, is we pivoted to the objects screen instantly to change some of the variables that we have in place, right? So we're going to reference some objects that we've created, like the DNS server, right? And I'm not going to go through this and extensively create all of them, but you get the idea, right? So we have, for home networks, we've got our inside network, our DMZ network. You could also add, you know, the PCI environment, for example. But it doesn't, well, it does matter, because what you want to do is ensure that we understand where in the environment these assets sit, so we can make better decisions in regard to threats coming in and what they mean to you, right? A lot of times a threat will come in and it'll be a Linux and Apache attack, for example, but you have no idea whether the asset on the other end is prone to that type of an attack. So we've simplified that by understanding passively your environment, and can make sense and give you an impact level. Now, you may have seen real quick, a whole bunch of policies got created. Because I've isolated my environment, I didn't have DNS set up. So when I went into security intelligence, I didn't have the feeds completely there yet, right? Because Firepower Management Center couldn't go out to the internet yet. And what I've done is I've done it later on in the series, and then just obviously edited the video to fit it in here. So disregard the extra stuff that you saw there. It was just to show you how to add security intelligence and how to block known bad IP addresses as well as known bad URLs. Now, we've jumped over to network discovery. Now, this is very, very important and really a differentiator, right? This is where we're going to say what assets within our environment are assets of interest that we want to discover certain things about them. In our case, we're going to discover hosts, users, and applications that could be associated with certain networks in our organization. And the reason why this is important is because we want to be able to truly understand that threat and the asset that's being targeted, right? We want to be able to give you an impact score that is meaningful. And in order to do that, we need to assess the environment to understand what we're protecting. So that's great. We have that. I'm going to add IPv6 here, and I'm just going to look for applications. I don't care about the host and users, because in my environment, and like many others, maybe we don't have IPv6 running, or we think we don't, and we want to know. Capture banner is just going to give higher levels of fidelity in regards to the assets. Users tab that you just saw there are protocols that we can pull usernames out of, right? So IMAP or LDAP, for example. We can pull, because they're the username, or FTP, right? We can pull those usernames out of the packet because they're in clear text and associated with the asset. Here we're going to deploy the policy, and we're going to kick it off here. Fantastic. And, you know, like many other times, so you see a minute and a few seconds that it took to deploy. Obviously, I fast-tracked it there because that was way faster than a minute. And now let's just see if we can get out to the internet. Fantastic. So we know DNS is getting out. We know our inside network is getting out. We can quickly go and look at some events, and we can see that there's a bunch of events coming in as we speak. And if we look at the asset, we can see that we've discovered a Windows 7 asset. We're going to go in this in detail throughout the video itself as we're, you know, building a certain element, and then we're coming in and testing it. So if we come in here, and so we've gotten out to the internet with no issue. But what if we try to go to the DMZ directly? What happens now? Well, the answer should be you can't get to it because we didn't build any policy to allow that. And we have a default block policy applied to the access control rule, right? So anything that doesn't match above it is going to get dropped, and anything, in our case, anything allowed is really from the inside to the outside zone. So what we're going to do here is we'll go through, and obviously we're going to build these policies as we go along. And we can see some of the things that we're pulling down. We can see the blue indicates, the blue around that little computer indicates that we've profiled the device. So the 244.100 device we've profiled, as well as many others as time goes on, right? All right, so let's go into the access control policy and build a policy so we can get to that DMZ server. In our case, there is no need to NAT, right? So we're coming from the inside network into the DMZ, and then the DMZ will provide us a response page. And again, no NATing required. So again, inside to DMZ, right? And we're going to take the inside network, and we can be very specific here. We're going to use the www.serve1 object for the server itself. And you know what? Let's just use HTTP here, right? As far as an application is concerned, and really restrict it even further. And again, this is an example. I only have HTTP running. All I did was create a Ubuntu box with Apache on it and using the default pages, right? Just to show that that there is a web page. Now this is where you could add additional security. In our case, we're again using the defaults and adding IPS. Now, if we assume that the security administrator has already developed these, there would be a custom one specific maybe to this flow or going into this environment or network, right? We'll deploy that policy, and then at some point we'll come back and we'll test it and make sure that we can actually now get to that page. All right. And you can see here the health, the interface status. We're showing you that we're not seeing packets on interfaces. And if we don't, you can have an alert that is generated, and you can see it very quickly. Look at that. We're back, and we can get to that web server. So that takes care of the inside to the DMZ, the inside to the outside. We've done the span interface. We've done that all up to this point. Now what we'll do is let's create a little more complexity, so to speak, where we're going to rate limit applications. So let's just quickly check, and we'll go to bbc.com, And you can see that it's, you know, fairly responsive. And remember, this is my home environment, so I've got decent stuff, but I don't have the same stuff that you would have in a data center, right? So you can see that we've got to BBC. I'm just going to flush the DNS here, just so there's no residual that's saved or cached. And let's add a policy. Now again, this QoS policy is almost like an object, right? I can create it, modify it, and then add the devices to this policy as I see fit. So we'll add a rule, and this is going to be a fairly simple rule, inside to outside, right? We grab the networks that were of interest, and we're going to grab the BBC application. So let's grab that inside network, add it as a source, and we're going to go anywhere. And let's grab the BBC application. There we go. Right? There's some other things there that we might want to do. You can do download, upload, but you can also be very specific if you hit the advanced and say, you know what, download I want X and upload I want Y, right? In our case, I'm going to keep them the same. It's pretty much going to make this application unusable. All right, so say OK, save that out. And again, we'll deploy that app now, or that policy. Now, you don't have to deploy as often as I am here. You could do multiple different steps along the way. So you can add a whole bunch of different elements. The reason why I like doing it in stages is I have the opportunity to test the policy as I move along. So here I'm just going to quickly clear connections to make sure there's no residual there, right? No open connection currently in play. We'll let that policy push, and again, a minute or so, that policy should be deployed, and then we can test the actual application and see whether or not we accomplish what we set out to do, right? And basically, in our case, it's all about making this app unusable, right? Okay, so now what we're going to do is, and some people don't realize this, so this is looking at connections with application detail, but you could look at the table view connection events, and this is where it breaks up into obviously a table form. You can see there's tons and tons of things here, and I can add or remove any element of my choosing, right? So when I go through here, I'm going to add a bunch of QoS specific parameters, right? Because in our case, that's what we want to look at. But I can build these out. I can save and bookmark. There's lots of different things that you can do, but there's no shortage of capabilities when it comes to searching. You'll see this throughout the video itself, right? So there's that. MSN came up fantastic, right? Pretty good. BBC. So we know we resolved. Let's see. And the circle goes round and round, right? So let's just have a quick look at the logs itself. And we'll do that by searching or leveraging our search capabilities. And what we're going to do is we're going to search based on the application or the web app called BBC. Perfect. Okay, so we can see that we've got a bunch of hits here. We know it's allow, so they can get through. We can see HTTP. There's BBC. So we see the web application itself. We scroll over. And we can see the QoS rule that was hit and the QoS policy. And finally, we can see QoS has dropped packets there. So fantastic. We achieved what we set out to do, and now we've got rate limiting taking place. So, you know, we're a few halfway through the session. We've got inside, outside, inside DMZ. We've got rate limiting. Now let's have a quick look at troubleshooting. We've got a couple of things done at this point in time. We know people are interested in, the troubleshooting capabilities of the platform. So let's just touch on this a little bit, right? So you can see I went to the device itself, and then I went to the little wrench, and then into advanced. And now we have packet tracer. Now, people that know the traditional ASA know about this tool, right? Is be able to come in here, simulate the traffic, and see what policy it may hit or trigger, right? And that could be whether that's an access control list, that could be a NAT policy, etc. We're going to highlight each one of those phases and let you know where the issue may lie, right? So we might say whether it's a pass, but we'll also say this is where it's failing, right? And it's pretty handy. So you can see we can pick source port here. In my case, we're just going to grab an upper layer port, for example, and we're going to use port 80. And we're actually coming into what will be that web server itself, okay? And as you go through, you can see some areas say allow, some areas say drop. But you just scroll down, and at the bottom, you can see it was an ACL drop, right? So it was based on, there was no rule to allow it. Now, there's two things happening here. The first one is we haven't created a static NAT rule for the DMZ server. So that IP doesn't even exist, right? And when we come in here, we're going to do a packet capture, and you're going to see that again. We're going to actually go to a host, and the host that I'm actually using here to connect to Firepower is on the outside network, right? It is part of the management network, but it is on the outside of the topology that I showed you. And we're going to connect to that web server. And you're going to see that we're going to get no packets because that IP address, like I said, doesn't exist. So now we have this packet capture. It's running at this point in time. And this includes packet trace all in one. Now you can turn off the trace portion if you choose to. But in my case, I want to see it because I want to know where the actual packet may be dropping and what's causing the drop. You can also download this packet and look at it in Wireshark. Okay, so you can see that we tried to go to that web server, turning and turning and turning and turning. It timed out, and we'll pause this, and you can see there's no packets being refreshed below, right? Because we're not capturing anything. So in order to do that, we're going to have to create a policy, right? And we'll do that, right? But before we do that, we're going to quickly show you how you could jump onto the Firepower Threat Defense Next Generation Firewall /sensor. Those names are interchangeable a lot of times. And we're going to do capture traffic here. And we're going to see real time, we can look at, the router itself, right? The passive interface or the inline set. So here I just quickly chose the passive zone. You can see some spanning tree protocol stuff happening. And we'll hit one, which is the router. And again, we're not seeing anything. And the reason why is I only have one host and there's very little communication from the inside to the outside. So we're not seeing anything traverse it. So let's just quickly log into this box. Log in as that HR user. And remember, we don't have Active Directory integration yet, but we're going to do that. All of that's going to be part of this 1 hour session. So now we hit Google, and you'll starting to see the packets come in, right? So fantastic, right? So we see that. That's good. And what we'll do now is we'll go to that access control policy, review the diagram. So we're going to take that orange server and we're going to now publish it to the internet. So we're actually going to jump back to NAT first, and we're going to configure the NAT policy. Now, I jumped to access control. But you have to remember, first we need to NAT the IP. We could have created the access rule. But the reason why is some people come in and create the NAT rule, and they'll think that, okay, well, I'm NATing it, why can't I get to that box? And the reason why you can't get to that box is because you still need to create a rule to allow it access, right, from the outside in. So we're going from DMZ to outside. We're translating the source network, www serve1, to a new object that we're going to create called www serve1-ext. We're going to add this as 21245.100, and it's a /32. And we'll select it now that we've created it. And again, we've created an object without having to go back and jump into the objects tab, right? We did it from here. We'll add HTTP on both the original source port and original or translated source port. We're not going to do any translation of port, but we could have said, 8080, for example, and then translate it to 80 or vice versa. So there's the rule. We save it out. Again, we could deploy here, but we also need that access rule. So we're going to quickly create that access policy. And again, in my case, I'm building out these policies, but they're not very, I'm not following any real standard-based naming convention. Typically you would certainly create a naming convention that's meaningful to your organization as you build these out. So where are we going? We're going from the outside source to the DMZ zone, which is the destination, right? We are going to grab the networks of interest. So we'll scroll down, and we're going to grab the actual IP address. We're not going to grab the NATed IP. We're going to actually do this based on protocol, right? So we'll do it based on HTTP, fairly simple rule. We'll add some logging just for our being able to see the connection events come in. But I have to note here is if you do additional inspections, you don't need to packet or log every single packet, right? So again, use it where appropriate, but you don't have to turn it on, for example, just to get an IPS trigger event. If you have IPS enabled, we will generate events regardless of whether you're logging the connection. And you end up optimizing the platform even further. So let's deploy this. Again, this takes a minute or so to fully deploy. And in the meantime, what we'll do is that once we get that set, we're going to go back to troubleshooting. And what I want to do here is finish or close the loop on the original troubleshooting packet capture that we did earlier. Remember, we weren't seeing any packets. So I just want you to get full visibility into the capability of the capture itself. So now we'll turn it on, right? And we're going to try to get to that site. And you can see here we're using the actual external IP address. And look at that. So we know NAT's working. We know the access policy is working. Let me pause this. And we should start seeing the results show up below. We could then go through and look at this. We can, make it full screen, and you can now go through and you can see we're unnat access list. It may go to snort for additional processing. We'll tell you what the results were in the snort processing. IP options, again, the flow creation, any additional inspections. There's the snort process there. It was pass, and then the ultimate action at the end is allow, right? So we passed, or we made it through all the other inspections, and obviously got the web page up. So we're good here. Again, now we've got lots of pieces working. Let's close the loop on that inline set. So this is where we're taking that VLAN 15 and 16, which is part of the same layer 3 network, and stitching that flow together. So currently, if we go in and we look at the hosts themselves, they wouldn't be able to ping each other, okay? And the reason being is because they don't have an access policy stitching them together. So in our case, we're using a physical connection to stitch the flows together, but we also have the ability to actually VLAN stitch, like logically taking an interface and then stitching it together. So here we're going 15, 16 to 16 to 15, right? So it's bidirectional, where we don't care. In this case, we're just going to do an ICMP allowed, and that's the only traffic in our case. But this could be a specific PCI application that you might want to control, right? So we'll add this, and it's an allow policy, so we have the ability to add additional inspections if we chose to do so. In our case, we're not going to do that. We're going to move the rule up a bit, and we'll add that rule. Now that we have that rule, we can deploy the policy and then test to see whether or not we're seeing any flow, right? So the result should be is that we're able to ping the devices on either side, right? In our case, you can see we're still deploying the policy, but currently we cannot ping anyway, right? And there's two reasons for that. One is the inline set isn't fully in play yet because we haven't built policy around it. And the second thing is that you'll see after this is that I have the firewall enabled. So policy is now pushed. We're still seeing it drop. We're going to come in here. We're going to disable the firewall on Windows. I'm not recommending that you disable anything, but in my case, I don't care. This is a lab environment for one. And I don't want to go through and just tweak it just for ICMP traffic. So you can see there now I can ping on the one side. And again, once I do this on this side, the other side should start seeing a success as well. And here we go. And fantastic. So that's it. The inline set's working, right? So that purple network is done. We've got the DMZ, the orange network completely done. The blue completely done. The green pretty much done. But hey, let's do a little bit more, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually integrate with Active Directory. So the first step in this is that we're going to add a realm. And that realm is going to be the Active Directory domain. And we'll add some credentials. You don't have to use the administrator username and password. I am in my case, but you could use a subset, a least privileged user, which would be recommended in most cases. But in my case, I'm just going to show you how quickly we can get this up and running and integrated and fully working. So we added the domain cisco.new, and then we're going to add the base DN and the group distinguished name. So in our case, is DC equals Cisco, comma DC equals new, and that's the same for both. And you could test here. I'm going to test this in a second. So that's great. Now we have a realm that's available. And now again, this becomes an object, right? That I can use later on. So here's our settings again, just if you want to reference it. You can also tweak some settings in here if you chose to do so. And at any point you can come in and test. Now we'll go back to directory. We'll add the actual domain controller itself. In my case, I only have one. You can also use encryption if you chose to do so. In my case, I'm not. I'll do a quick test, and it succeeded. Fantastic. I'll say OK. And now I have the directory, so the actual domain controllers. I have the realm configuration, and now I'm going to download the actual user groups of interest. So in my case, I really only care about sales and HR, but you can add a couple extra if you chose to do so, if you want to build policy. But you don't need to add all of these, right? In most cases, you're not building policy around every single group object that you have within Active Directory. Okay, so there we go. We got the sales, we got HR. Let's add domain admins for fun, right? We're not actually going to use that, but what I wanted to do is show you that you can certainly add multiple different groups to this to include. You could also do exclusions as well. So now that we have it there and configured, what we'll have to do is actually click enable, so that if you look at the state, if you just go to the right side of that, that'll enable it. And then for my case, I'm just going to download just to make sure I have the groups. And you can see here 3 groups were downloaded, right, in the task list. 3 groups and 3 users. So the 3 users will be sales 1, HR 1, and the administrator would be the users, and each one associated to a group, obviously. So now that we have the realm configured, what we want to do now is get the user to IP mappings. In order to do that, we use an agent, and that agent would pull, you know, the event Windows event logs, security logs, to see log in, log off events. So we've got that configured on the Firepower Management side. Now you can install this on Windows. You can install this on multiple versions, right? They don't have to be the domain controller. It could be a member server. It could be a workstation for that matter. In my case, I've got it on Windows 2012 R2, and I'm configuring it as a member server. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to add Active Directory and connect it. And then once this is complete, I'm going to move over to Firepower Management Center itself, or sorry, the tab Firepower Management, and add the IP address to Firepower Management Center. Once I do that, now I'm pulling user to IP mappings. And because I have 2 interfaces on this network, I'm capturing the one that I'm interested in, which is the interface that I selected. Okay, so this is where, again, I'm adding the FMC IP, so that's the .170. That's what we've been connected to this whole time when we were building out our configurations. And we'll save this out, and then, you know, we'll see available throughout any exclusions that we might have. You can see here it's pretty nice and green, so we can visually see very quickly whether or not things are working. Now what we have to do, again, is create an identity policy. Now, we can do active and passive authentication. In our case, we're just going to use passive. And today we use the Cisco Firepower User Agent. Tomorrow, what you'll be leveraging in most cases moving forward is what we call Identity Services Engine. And you can use that if you've purchased the product, or if you want a lighter version, there's what we call is a passive identity connector. And again, it's ICE, but it's a subset of ICE. It's still a full version of ICE. And you can leverage it, but that's what we're doing moving forward. Now you can see here we created an inside to outside and DMZ, and then we added that domain that we selected. So that's great. Now when we come in here, I'm going to show you something, and people sometimes miss this. So they'll come in and they'll build that, in our case, the HR policy. Now that we have the identity policy created, we should be able to start leveraging users, right, from Active Directory. So again, this is an access control list with multiple rules in it. And in our case, we're creating an HR policy inside network to any, right? So basically what we're saying is HR is allowed. We're going to give it, we're going to move it up a little bit. We're going to enable some logging. And then we're just going to go to the user tab, but nothing's here. And you can see the little yellow up beside the user's icon. And that means we forgot to add the identity policy. So no worries. All we do is just add the policy. You can see now we've superseded some lower policies, right? Because this overrides it now, because it encompasses all the ones below. But that's all we have to do to add it. So now we've added that identity policy, right, that we created. We'll go back to access control. We could have just done that from just moving over to the tab, but I chose to go to the top. and come back in here, and now we should see the Active Directory that we created, or the identity that we created, and now we have the HR group. Save it out, and you can see the policies under that have got rid of that yellow warning light. In our case, we're going to copy and paste this, and then we're just going to modify. So in our case, we got the HR user that's allowed to go anywhere, and then we're going to have the sales user blocked from going to the DMZ server, and then we'll have them allowed to go anywhere else. But this one will obviously be higher up in the chain, but we'll have to remove the outside zone. So inside the DMZ, we're going to say block. We're going to get rid of the HR user, and now we'll add the sales group. Sorry, so I should have said group, not user, but we could have selected user. All right, now we'll copy this, and for the rest of this, we're just going to allow them inside to outside, and it'll be full access, but it will be based on the sales group, right? So get rid of the DMZ, add the outside. User should be good. Yep, sales, that's fantastic. And we'll just add the logging. Save this out, and then we're going to deploy here. So we're coming to the end of the session here, right? So this will deploy. Here's the HR user. We'll quickly log in. We'll make sure that the HR user can go to both sites, meaning outside as well as the DMZ. And then we'll quickly do, in our case, we're going to quickly do a reboot. And I'm going to log in as a Sales 1 user. So there's the internet. You can see MSN behind. Now we're going to go to that DMZ server, which is internal to us. So that's why we're not using the external IP, and we're good. Quick reboot. We're going to log in as the sales user, and we're going to do the same thing. But the difference should be is that they get to the internet, but they cannot get to that DMZ web server. All right, so there's the web page, there's MSN, and let's go to the DMZ server. Thanks, Internet Explorer, for letting me know about my browser is out of date. And you can see that we're turning. Now, I could have also added things like an interactive block that gave the user a message. In my case, I didn't give them anything. So let's just look around here. Actually, you can see, you know, some things in the connection events. You can toggle between. You can also look at users and what user data that we're pulling. We can also use search, right? And we can look for a specific user connection events and see whether or not we see that block action. So let's look at connection events, and you can see the amount of search capabilities and attributes that we can leverage. Here we're going to do the sales 1. I could save this as a search. So for example, a lot of times we see this with things like DNS sinkholing, right? You want to know all the elements that were sinkholed. You can create an object fairly quickly. So we can see that we've got some block here. We can see the sales 1 user, right? We got that through LDAP. If I click on the actual asset, so this is the responding, this is the web server, and this is the profiling I was talking about earlier. You can see that we've seen it as Ubuntu, and it's got Apache 2410. Again, all important when we're trying to associate threat to the asset. If we go back and look at the asset that the user is connected to, you're going to see that the user is associated to it. The version we picked up is Windows 7, and there's the applications that are currently running on, and other users that may have logged into that asset. So there's HR1 and Sales 1. So if that was an asset that shouldn't be leveraged, we would certainly, as a shared asset, we would know that other people were logging in. Anyways, that's it for this session. Thank you.